maybe the most controversial topic that I have taken on this channel would have to be, did Hero Factory kill Bionicle Generation 1? I'm not somebody who has given a lot of thought to this idea. I don't let it occupy that much space in my mind because ultimately it doesn't really matter, right? We live in the reality we live in where Bionicle Generation 1 was canceled in 2010 and replaced, or at least, substituted for Hero Factory, which in its own right has some staying power, has some really interesting ideas and sets that are tackled within that series. That said, though, what is Hero Factory but, in essence, I don't want to say a reboot. It's a completely different series from Bionicle, but at the very least, it starts off using Bionicle pieces, or at least Bionicle adjacent pieces. I have one figure from Hero Factory Wave 1, 1.0, all the way back in 2010, here right in front of me. And actually, the version of this figure that I have in front of me is from a special edition set. Not because I own that set, it's just very easy to make this figure. But there's another reason why I chose this figure specifically for this video. If you guys are familiar with the latest years of Bionicle, 2008 and 2009 in particular, you'll start to notice a specific trend that is introduced with the Avmatoran wave carried over to the Agori wave as well. And I also have one of those in front of me here. Again, this one very specifically. And it's the lack of any sort of what I'm going to call for this video base connectors, pins, axles, things like that. Essentially what you really need for Technic sets to be Technic, right? For a set to have Technic holes in it is one thing, but if those holes go unused, then is it really truly a Technic set? Now, we know that Bionicle started off as a sort of Technic sub-theme, which I think is quite fantastic. Obviously, again, I'm a big fan of classic Bionicle, so that's always something I've admired about the theme, but it gained its own identity as time went on. In 2008, though, of course, with the introduction of the Avmatoran, they sort of introduced their own building system, not in a whole, obviously, but as a sort of logical conclusion of what the Anika building system is, right? What is the Anika building system if not taking a torso, taking hips, slapping the two together, and then adding limbs and other pieces directly to that? The Avmatoran take it one step further, though, by fusing the actual hips and torso into a single piece, and then giving us various types of pieces to fill out specific roles. Now, obviously, the Avmatoran would introduce two new body types for 2008. Of course, Hero Factory would introduce its own body type that followed a very similar plan as well. And then you also had Ben 10 out there, which did its own thing, but also introduced a body similar to these various different sizes. And if you take a look at these, they sort of feel like precursors in a lot of ways to CCBS. Now, we know from experience from LEGO themselves, in a lot of cases, LEGO doesn't just introduce something to the market immediately, but they often will sort of toy around with the idea, design things for years in advance. And it makes me think that, is it possible that LEGO was designing CCBS in 2008? And I say this because 2008 introduced to the world one of the biggest mistakes I think LEGO's ever made, at least in the world of Bionicle, and that is the fragile socket joint, of which this character right here uses 4. But basically, nearly every socket that appeared after 2008 had this socket type, this squared off socket with thinner plastic, and ultimately made of what I believe is a more brittle plastic, and there are specific reasons why I think that might be the case. But ultimately, LEGO had to be made aware of this pretty early on. If they did not catch this problem during their own playtesting, which I don't know how they couldn't, but if they didn't catch this problem with these sockets breaking during quality control, then at the very least, when they started sending out products for review and reviewers were getting their hands on them and noticing these pieces were breaking right out of the box, right out of the canister, LEGO had to be made aware of that pretty quickly. Now, obviously, they could have gone backwards a bit and started redesigning the sockets once again, which ultimately they did do for CCBS, which was introduced all the way in 2011. Kind of not, though, right? Ben 10 which is an interesting theme to bring up for a video like this, but actually has a lot of sockets within that theme because it introduces a lot of new parts in it that ultimately are sort of a precursor towards CCBS sockets, right? Much thicker, much more durable in their design, and they're sort of a hybrid between the 2008 style squared off socket or Generation 2 socket, whatever you want to call it, and the CCBS sockets that we would get introduced to us in 2011 for the most part. Again, some pieces would carry over from 2010, so they would have more fragile sockets on them. Some pieces were redesigned from earlier than 2010 with the newer, more reinforced sockets, but ultimately, it just makes me think, it begs the question that is the reason Bionicle ended because LEGO didn't want to introduce this new, very different sort of design concept for these robotic characters ultimately, right? Because Bionicle has a very specific aesthetic to it. And while I think Bara Magna is a sort of refreshing step that could have led us in that direction, especially by painting out that these characters were supposedly organic, right? CCBS does a great job at filling out a more organic feel, at least in comparison to Bionicle sets and their pistons and gears and so on, right? But ultimately, it makes me think that maybe, just maybe, this was one of their ideas. Introduce this concept of Bara Magna and then maybe slowly replace these characters with that CCBS building system. I don't know that. Again, there's no way that I can know that outside of just, asking people that maybe worked for LEGO around 2010. But ultimately, it's a fascinating idea to toy around with. Now, that being said, I don't think it's the only thing that would have killed Bionicle. But there are other reasons why I bring this up, right? Again, having Hero Factory start off as essentially, very proudly, a Bionicle follow-up, right? The canister sets, the sets themselves said from the designers of Bionicle right on them. It's still used many Bionicle pieces. Many Bionicle pieces were recolored for this theme. And it makes me think, could this not have just been marketed as Bionicle? Once again, maybe this time around, we were visiting another planet out there. I'm not saying that that's what should have happened. I'm glad that it didn't, honestly, because I would have loved to have stayed on Bara Magna much longer than we had, ultimately. But that's, of course, not what we got. LEGO obviously very quickly, very haphazardly sort of tied up Bionicle's run, I assume, in tandem with CCBS, but it makes you think, well, then why wouldn't they introduce Hero Factory in 2011, right? Forget about 2010, continue having that as a Bionicle year, and then in 2011, with the introduction of CCBS, introduce these new characters, these new parts. And I think the main reason for that is that characters like these are a foot in the door, right? These are still familiar to Bionicle builders because they contain Bionicle pieces, where CCBS can absolutely contain, and does in some scenarios contain, Bionicle pieces or Bionicle adjacent pieces. Ultimately, it is still different enough that I think had they been like, okay, Bionicle is canceled, Hero Factory starts, we have a brand new building system, it may have alienated too many of the fans of Bionicle that LEGO was trying to get in there, right? Obviously, Hero Factory was marketed towards, younger audiences because that's what you would continually want to do for a toy line, right? Adults are eventually going to grow out of, ultimately, many toy lines, and LEGO couldn't predict that, toys would become popular collectibles. Like, they knew. But what I'm trying to get at here is that Bionicle is an interesting theme. Hero Factory is an interesting theme. There's a lot to look at. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to subscribe. It really helps out the channel. The other reason that I actually went ahead and threw the silver guy in here, the green guy in here, is because this is actually the biggest, in terms of parts count, a gory type or Avmatoran type build that we ever got from Bionicle, being 17 pieces. And it's fun to know that the Hero Factory heroes from Wave 1 from 1.0, outside of this character right here, were always between 17 and 19 pieces. Essentially, they were beefed up gory. I showcased this one because this actually gives a lot of love, and maybe it'll become its own separate video towards actually modifying these builds, because they do leave a lot on the table for you to continually redesign, rework. And there are some other reasons why I brought that one up too. But again, Those will be videos in the future. So if you want to see those, be sure you're subscribed. Helps out the channel tremendously. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Why did Lego end Bionicle? And, well, you can check out the links for Discord and everything else in the description. I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.